Good morning, good day, good afternoon, and good evening. In today's lesson, I will be helping you to navigate your way through preparing for paper 2 of your business studies assessments. We must begin our discussion of the paper 2 business report by asking, what is the purpose of the business report? In other words, what are business reports for? The answer is, they are drafted to assist in decision making. They are about communicating information that can be acted upon. And the audience, who are they for? Before we answer that question, I'd like to digress a bit and speak about influence. You can't influence or convince someone of anything if you don't understand what their needs are. Now, this doesn't mean you need to know the person intimately. In fact, you don't need to know them at all. But you need to know what their needs are so you can best equip or prepare yourself to add value or help them to solve their problems. This is often referred to as audience analysis. Now, this sounds fancier than what it actually is for our purposes in business studies. And the reason why we don't have to worry about audience analysis too much and too deeply is because generally within the question, we tell you what the audience's needs are. So that puts you in a relatively safe position when it comes to audience analysis. Anyways, back to our business report. The answer to the question of who are they for is they are for decision makers to assist them in making important decisions. This means that you have to demonstrate that your information is reliable, and you must therefore refer to facts and figures. We will discuss shortly that part of your report that must include strategies that you recommend must be implemented in order to overcome a problem or challenge. It is not enough to identify and explain problems, gaps, threats, opportunities, and so forth. You must then propose or at least attempt to identify strategies to overcome these problems or gaps or threats that you've come up with or identified rather. For example, if you are analyzing the microenvironment of a company and you raise the autocratic leadership style as a problem because it results in a high staff turnover. Now, for those of us who aren't sure what high staff turnover is, staff turnover just means how frequently do staff leave the company. So the higher the turnover, the more people there are leaving your company, which is not a good thing because it means you need to retrain people and you lose that continuity in the experience. Anyways, if you identify or raise the autocratic leadership style as a problem because it results in high staff turnover, you must then suggest a strategy to overcome this. Now, that strategy could be as simple as instructing top management to train middle management in different leadership styles so that a more democratic leadership style is employed that gives other employees a voice. Now, this is often the part that learners generally leave out the most. The part where we require you guys to propose a strategy to solve the problems you identified in your essays. And it's perhaps understandable why that would be the case. The rest of the stuff you either remember from the textbook because it's part of your prescribed content, or it involves general knowledge you have about a particular industry or a market in general. Whereas proposing a strategy requires a bit more initiative and higher order thinking. Now, this is not to say that this is the only part of the report that requires higher order thinking. Linking your general knowledge to the theory also requires some higher order thinking. Anyways, I wish again to stress that at this early stage, you are writing a report for decision makers. This may or may not be your manager. It could also just be a colleague on the same level as you in terms of ranking, or even lower in the organizational hierarchy. Now that would be rare, generally, since the decision makers often occupy the top of the food chain in the company, so to speak. That is not to say that people who aren't managers do not make decisions. This depends largely on the type of organization as well as the management style employed by the business. In an autocratic structure, the business report is likely to be going to the one decision maker. However, in a laissez-faire structure, the report could be for one of the many people vested with decision-making powers and responsibilities. It is important to know the purpose of the business plan, as this will help us to forge our way forward when we get stuck while compiling the report. Understanding the why allows us to more easily decide what to include and what to leave out. Now, the next step in the process is drafting our business report. The first part of the business plan is the least complicated. Who is it addressed to? You can see that the slide explains that you need to check your question to make sure that you include the recipient's title if you've been given one. Other than that, the to section is straightforward. Who is it from? You must include the author's title, if appropriate. The person sending it may not be the person who drafted it. You may have hired a consultant, a lawyer, or another person with appropriate expertise to draft it on your behalf. So the drafter and the sender may or may not be the same person. We just need to be mindful of that. In the question, we may ask you to take on a specific role in the organization. We may, for example, instruct you to write a business report as the Director of Global Affairs at Nike. You will then write down your title next to your name, just so the decision maker reading the document understands why he should take this document seriously and why he should take your thoughts and your opinions seriously. In other words, you want to establish your relevance and perhaps even your credibility. The business report is meant to be persuasive. You need to persuade the decision maker that you are right, reliable, have expertise, have done your due diligence or homework, and so forth. Otherwise, people will start to question why you get paid to do what you do, and that's not a position you ever want to find yourself in. You generally want to appeal to knowledge and facts. In English, we call this logos, which roughly translates to logic. You can also appeal to the character, authority, and/or reputation of the writer or the compiler of the report. Remember, once again, you are the writer or the compiler. So you want to establish your character and your reputation by using a title. We refer to this in English as ethos, which is why you often hear us referring to the ethos of the school. Now you know that it means the character or reputation of a person or an organization. If it's a report advising on whether a company should consider setting up an office in a new country, then if a document signed off by the Director of Global Affairs, the reader can assume that this author has some level of expertise and knowledge of the company's global affairs. Next up is the topic. This will generally be the topic given to you in the question paper. This should be one sentence or phrase. We could give you a question that reads as follows. Nike is considering expanding factories and production into South Africa. The owner has tasked you to create a team and provide a macro analysis of the prospects of expanding its production into South Africa. In this case, a good example of a good topic would be the viability of expanding manufacturing into South Africa, dash a macroeconomic analysis, or the feasibility of establishing operations into South Africa, and macro environment investigation. I've broken my topic down into two parts. I did so firstly because it is aligned to the instruction. What it does is that it serves to remind me that I have only been instructed to analyze the macro environment, so I should not waste time looking at market factors or microenvironment factors, because they are outside of the scope of the instruction. This sets the scope or the boundaries for me, and I won't come and cry to the teacher trying to understand why I didn't get marks for this part of my essay when I think it is correct and or relevant. The second reason why I included the second part, which is the dash and macro environment investigation, is because the reader understands the scope of the investigation. It would be dangerous if I just labeled it the viability of establishing operations into South Africa, because this could induce the reader to assume that this is a comprehensive study or investigation of the South African environment, including the market and the microenvironment. And that would be false and misleading, because my instruction has been to analyze the macro environment and nothing else. And this could of course result in bad decisions being made. So even though I started off by saying that the first part of the business plan is the least complicated, we can already appreciate that this is not as straightforward as I've made it sound either. This is why I insist and emphasize that you have to have the purpose of the report in mind. Which decision are you trying to assist the decision maker to make? Having this in mind helps us to make decisions on what to include and what to leave out. Next is the date. This section really is as simple as it sounds. However, generally, when it comes to business writing, we do not refer to the 5th of July and so on. It's simply 5 July. Next up is the actual content of your report. The first part, no surprises, is your introduction. Here you outline the key points that you are going to address. This section is easier to explain by making use of an example. Let's look at the following example of a question from a paper 2 assessment. Lyft is a ride-hailing company like Uber and Taxify. Currently, they only operate in the USA and Canada. They are Uber's main competitor in the USA and are considering expanding into South Africa. You have been hired as an external consultant to provide a local perspective on the prospect of setting up the Lyft business in Johannesburg. Now, as a good business studies student, you already know that when you're considering the prospect of setting up a business, you have to analyze the macro environment. The best tool we have for this is the pestle analysis, where we analyze the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors and their possible impact on the business. We also know that you must analyze the market environment. The tool we have for this as a business studies learner is the Porter's six-force analysis. However, luckily for you guys, we often then give you further guidance and tell you something like this in the question. It'll have a heading saying requirements. Write a business report to Lyft's Director of Global Business, in which you analyze the feasibility of setting up Lyft's business in South Africa, and specifically in Johannesburg. Now, we shouldn't need to tell you to draft a business report, because you already know that that is the required format for a paper 2 question. We also don't need to repeat the content of the report, the feasibility of setting up Lyft's business in South Africa, because you should be skilled and experienced enough to pick up or distill that from the question. And once again, even more luckily for you guys, we may even further clarify that in your report, you need to identify and analyze the challenges in the macro and market environments in which Lyft operates. And we may even further instruct you to use the pestle analysis when analyzing the macro environment and use Porter's 6-force model to describe and analyze the market environment. At this stage, you know that the body will involve primarily a pestle analysis and a Porter's 6-force model. We could have also asked you to recommend which form of ownership they should consider employing. Then you would also include a discussion of the different forms of ownership and make a recommendation based on your findings. Now again, the fact that we've instructed you to use a pestle analysis to analyze the macro environment, we shouldn't need to do that because you guys know that the tool we have for the macro environment is the pestle. And likewise for the market environment, we should know by now that you must use the Porter's 6-force model. So strictly speaking, we could leave out that last part and you guys should be able to do a fantastic job of analyzing the two markets. Okay, now it's time for the introduction. Let's start off by looking at the requirements of the introduction. Firstly, you must outline the key points or content areas that you are going to address. Now, what's a content area, sir? It's like a topic. You need to just address it and introduce it. So, for example, a content area would be the pestle analysis, would be the Porter's 6-force model. So just outline those, define them, let us know what they are, why do we use them, when do we use them. Do not explicitly state, this business report will address or cover XYZ, or in the following business report we will discuss. Do not do that, you will get 0 for your introduction. And lastly, do not simply reword the question topic. Once you know the key concepts you are going to address, you will introduce and outline these key concepts in your introduction. In the previous example, the two key concepts are the pestle analysis and the Porter's 6-force model. Your introduction should therefore, at the very least, introduce and explain these two concepts. Now we could also use a SWOT analysis to analyze the macro and market environments, because we could look at the opportunities and threats that are present there. We can't use the S and the W because it speaks to strengths and weaknesses. In strengths and weaknesses, we know that they are internal and they are things we have control over. And we know that the macro and market environments look at external factors over which we have no control. However, we were explicitly instructed to use the pestle and Porter's, so we'll do just that. What you have been instructed to do essentially is an environmental scan. It is important to do an environmental scan to identify factors that may impact the business and then adjust existing plans or develop new plans to deal with these factors or events. Now, the macro environment includes factors that are in the external environment, and the business has little or no control over these. This is me now beginning my introduction. A pestle analysis is used to investigate the macro environment to identify issues which need to be addressed. Porter's 6-factor model is a tool used to assess the desirability of the market environment. Another word for explaining what the desirability of the market environment is whether there is potential to make sustainable profits in the market environment. This is what it means to introduce key concepts. Once again, if forms of ownership formed part of the question, then you'd also introduce and explain the concept of forms of ownership. Now, however, it is important to notice that you may want to give a bit more detail on the topic that you're going to start expanding on in your essay. So if you're going to deal with pestle analysis in the beginning, then you don't want to do a long introduction of the Porter six-factor model and break down the concepts, because chances are you'll have to go and repeat yourself when you then do the Porters later in your essay. So you'll just need to manage that and avoid repetition. But you guys will get a better sense of that in the next lesson when we do a practical example. We have now addressed the first requirement of the introduction, which was outline the key points or content areas you are going to address. Next, we need to remember the following 2 points. Once again, you do not state explicitly what the key content areas you are going to address are. In other words, do not write, this business report will address or cover a pestle analysis of lift, etc., etc. We also know that in English literature essays, you guys are advised to reword or rephrase the question topic. Do not do that in business studies. Simply introduce and explain the key concepts as I've explained just now. Next up is the main part of the report, where you will earn most of your marks, and that is the body or the content section. First things first, use headings and subheadings to plan and structure your argument. As a marker, you can tell an essay that is going to be problematic at first glance. How? That is often because it does not contain any headings or subheadings. You also need to integrate the topics given in the question so that there is a story or a logical flow in your argument. I will keep re-emphasizing this point as we go through some sample questions. Use transition words and phrases to guide your reader and ensure flow. You'll be given a list of linking words and phrases such as nevertheless, nonetheless, and as far as X is concerned, and so forth, so that you guys have these words in your word arsenal and have them ready and memorized for when you write your essays. Make sure you address all aspects of the question. If you've been instructed to analyze the macro and market environments, and you write a beautiful essay that only includes a macro environment analysis and no market analysis, then you cannot and will not get full marks. Another example of an incomplete answer would be, in a form of ownership's question, you must address both advantages and disadvantages of the relevant forms of ownership, and then conclude by making a recommendation with reasons. If you only discuss the positives, then you have only answered half the question and should expect to get half the content marks. Bullet points are acceptable and are often encouraged where appropriate. Explain every statement of fact you make. For example, in a report on forms of ownership, you may wish to state that a sole proprietor does not have legal personality. Now this is correct and you will get a mark. However, you cannot just give this statement about a sole proprietorship and then move on to the next point. If you give a bare statement of fact, you will get your lower order mark. You must then go on to explain that this means that the business cannot enter into contracts on its own name and cannot sue or be sued. You will then be awarded another lower order mark for this explanation of the statement of fact. If required, you may add a further explanation such as, it also means that the owner of the business must enter into contracts in his own name. And once again, we'll give you another lower order mark for this. So you can see we're quite generous. We'll reward you. This increases the risk to the owner if anything does go wrong in the business and the business is held liable. Now you can see that after providing a statement of fact and explanation or explanations, you must then justify why you included that statement of fact. You must substantiate or explain its relevance or link to the problem question. How does this help the decision maker to solve the problem? For this, you'll be awarded a higher order mark because you are now applying the statement of fact to the facts. Now that we have gone through the requirements of the body, let us continue with the practical example that we have begun drafting based on our sample question about Lyft, who is considering entering the South African e-hailing market. An example of the first heading we can distill from the sample question is analysis of the South African macro environment. Now that's a good enough heading. We can then include a subheading under the analysis of the South African macro environment, which will be a pestle analysis. So what about subheadings? Yes, those are allowed as well. So you've got pestle analysis, which is your subheading 2, macro environment analysis. And then within the pestle analysis, you've got your 2, 4, 6 pestle factors, which include political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors. So I write down my subheading, a pestle analysis, and then I explain what it is. Each of the letters in the pestle represents a factor in the macro environment that could potentially threaten the business, or that the business may use as an opportunity to create or strengthen its competitive advantage. Guys, the main purpose of every business is to create or sustain or strengthen their competitive advantage. So our first subheading could be political factors. Now this factor is important in relation to the local political situation in the country in which the business operates or seeks to operate. But obviously it also includes world politics in general. We know that when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. We also need to remember that political factors and legal factors are closely related. Why? Because our politicians write and amend our laws. When one reviews the political factors that may impact on the business, the following aspects should be considered. And the first aspect is the likelihood of the government interfering in the economic functioning of the country, and therefore the running of businesses. And of course this depends on whether your government believes in a free market or they believe in socialism or communism. That'll help us to decide whether to establish businesses or not. In a free market, we know of course that there are strong property rights, and whatever I own, and no one can question me as to what is the history of it. If I've got legal title, I've got legal title. No one's going to come and take my property. No one will come and tell me how to run my business. And generally, entrepreneurs want to operate in a free market. The degree of political stability in the country and its impact on business confidence. South Africa is one of the more politically stable countries in the world, actually. We haven't had any meaningful political conflict ever since we became a democracy. So generally, we are quite stable for now. Political ties with other countries, as this may, for instance, influence trade agreements. An example would be if South Africa is a trading partner with the USA, then chances are the USA is going to require us to take measures to protect intellectual property rights. So whenever they catch people making knockoffs of American products, the South African police must arrest and prosecute people. And if America is of the opinion that we're not doing that, they may decide that they don't feel like doing business with us because we are compromising their business by not allowing their creators to benefit from their intellectual property. And we're allowing people to create knockoffs of their music, of their clothing, and so forth. The degree of media freedom or freedom of speech, which may be used to criticize political parties in the country when government officials find themselves being guilty of corruption. We are lucky in South Africa that you can say just about anything about any of our politicians, provided that you don't overstep the line and engage in hate speech. So that's political factors. The second letter is the E, and it stands for economic factors. Now, these are economic factors that may affect the business and which ought to be analyzed to assess the implications, and they include economic growth. Has South Africa been experiencing economic growth for the past couple of years, and what's the projection? But also there's economic growth versus real growth. You may find that the economy is growing by 5%, however the population is growing by 10%. So in real terms, actually, our economy has shrunk by 5% because it's not growing enough to make up for the increase in population. So that's a figure a lot of us need to be concerned with and read it. So is the standard of living of people in the country getting better or getting worse? What is the trend? If it's getting better, it means that going forward, people will be able to afford more goods and services, which is a signal to come in and produce goods and services in the country. Inflation rates. Inflation is the continuous and significant increase in the general price level of goods and services. The higher the inflation rate, the lower the purchasing power of the money in the country. Now we are lucky, we've got a reserve bank that has inflation targeting as one of their core values, and they ensure that they manipulate interest rates in such a way that prices don't just skyrocket unnecessarily till we find ourselves in a place where we can't afford basic goods and services. Interest rates, that is the rate at which people or businesses borrow money from the bank, or a percentage return on investment when saving money in the bank. High interest rates, of course, make it difficult for businesses to borrow money to expand. So that's a disincentive for a business to come and open up in South Africa. However, just because a business is operating in South Africa doesn't mean that it has to borrow its money locally. It can go and borrow its money in the UK market or the American market or the Chinese market and pay Chinese or American interest rates. So don't let that limit your recommendation as to whether the company should invest in the country or not. High interest rates are also problematic because they determine how much of my income I will spend on paying my mortgage, bond, and how much interest I'll pay on my car, which I've financed through the bank. As interest rates increase, all of a sudden I go from paying 20,000 Rand a month for my house to 22,000 Rand. Now I've got 2,000 Rand less to spend on McDonald's and other things. So high interest rates also mean that the citizens of the country have a lower disposable income. And as a business, you want people to have more disposable income because they have more money to spend on your business. Exchange rates. The strength of the local currency versus currencies of other countries. If the rand depreciates against other currency, it will become more expensive to import from that other country. However, if you want to establish a business in South Africa that exports to other countries, then it is in your best interest to, if the rand actually depreciates, because if the rand depreciates, it means that someone in America can buy more goods, more South African goods with per dollar, because now his dollar gets him more rands and he gets more value, and that may encourage him to start importing from South Africa instead of Uganda. So exchange rates, it's not always a bad thing if the rand depreciates. It's good for exporters, it's bad for importers. So if you're a clothing company, you import clothes from China, then if the rand depreciates, then you are worse off because you now have to buy Chinese yuan at a higher rate, and therefore you can afford fewer goods per rand. High unemployment rates mean people do not have money, and as a result, businesses suffer from lower profits. Obviously, South Africa already had a disturbingly high unemployment rates before COVID. Obviously, with COVID and people being laid off and people being required to take pay cuts, this has had an even more adverse effect on this. So if I had to give you a paper to essay now, you would have to mention high unemployment rates as one of the economic factors, because it definitely has a significant and direct impact on any business that you start here. Taxes such as income tax, VAT, import duties, and so forth. If the government sets the for example, the income tax too high, then people don't want to live here because 50% of their income goes to the government. I think the majority of your parents, if you go and speak to them, will tell you that half of their income goes to the government in the form of tax. Now, the third factor are social factors, or also known as socio-economic factors. And these refer to the impact that social trends have on the economy and the role players in the economy, such as businesses and consumers' behavior and their lifestyle. Businesses have to adapt to changes in social trends. So, for example, think about the most obvious one, the impact of social media on the world around you. Now, businesses have adapted their marketing and sales tactics to utilize opportunities related to the use of mobile devices. There are many other factors to consider in this regard, and they include the average age of the population. In Africa, the average age of our population is getting younger and younger, but also more and more unemployed. So when you're planning for the future, you need to take into account the fact that you're going to be dealing with the majority young population. Whereas in Japan, the last time I checked, they got to a point where they were selling more adult diapers than baby diapers, because that's how aged their population is. And how do you adjust to that? The number of single parents providing for a family, the number of child-headed households, HIV infection and diseases such as TB and malaria, levels of literacy and education, unemployment rates, personal safety and crime, awareness of the issue of pollution and recycling, distribution of wealth and poverty. South Africa is called a very wealthy country. However, there's a small group of people who hold all the wealth, while the rest of the people are quite poor. So unless you are aware of that distribution of wealth, you'll think that, okay, if I need a customer base of 1 million people, I can set up in America, I can set up in South Africa because it's a rich country. However, if you need 1 million people to buy, let's say, to buy bread, but only 10% of the population can afford bread, then you've made a miscalculation because you failed to take into account that distribution of income. Yes, the 30% who own the wealth do have enough money to buy all 1 million units of your bread, but they've got no need for 1 million units of bread. Whereas if the income was more evenly spread, then you'd have 1 million people buying 1 loaf of bread each, and then your business could be viable. So you need to be aware of the distribution of wealth and poverty. The changing role of women in society in certain cultures, that's very important. Those of you who watch soapies like Generations and The Queen and so forth, soapies got soapies got their name from soap adverts. They used to play soapies during the time when they were advertising soap, because they knew that all the women were at home looking after the house and looking after the babies. Whereas things are changing now. Women aren't sitting at home watching soap adverts. Then next are technological factors. Technology refers to equipment the business uses to buy, advertise, or sell their products or service. You can think of the following factors that impact in the business. We've already referred to the rapid development of issues surrounding social media. Social media advertising is on the come up. I think you guys know more about it than I do. I think some of you guys are already paid influencers who get paid to market people's goods and services on the internet. Excuse me. There's things like automation of different processes, which means that we require less use of lower skilled labor. And a classic example of this is in the motor industry. Many people have lost their jobs because machines can now do the work that people used to be able to do. Advances in online money transfers allows us to engage in more transactions safely. Online shopping. If you're a store with a physical presence, you need to bear in mind the shift to online shopping. And maybe if all your competitors are offering online shopping, then you need to get on the bandwagon. And then the legal environment. That refers to all the laws that impact on the business. And they include laws that protect the environment against exploitation and pollution. So you may find that a few mines are now leaving South Africa because we've got first world regulations in a third world country. It's also obviously debatable as to whether we're a third world country or not. But our regulations make it expensive to operate a mine in South Africa because we are trying to protect the environment. At some point, the government needs to reach a balance between encouraging people to invest in mines so that we can create jobs versus protecting our environment so that we can engage in sustainable growth where our use of the environment now doesn't compromise the use of future generations. Then there's criminal justice that protects businesses against piracy and rip-offs. That's very important. In the past year and a bit, we've seen the South African police raiding lots of shops that are selling knockoffs and rip-offs, and that's to protect businesses and their intellectual property. In our case, where we looked at Lyft, who is trying to get into South Africa and compete with Uber, the Johannesburg government deliberately made sure that they protected Uber when some of the taxi owners, the meter taxi owners, were attacking Uber drivers and they were being burned and stoned and all that stuff. The government applied the law and chose not to look to the side, and they gave them protection. And maybe this is a positive aspect of the South African legal environment for Lyft. They know that the government will implement laws and prosecute criminals. And of course, laws relating to paying tax, registering businesses, health and safety specifications for dealing with food. Once again, in South Africa, there are lots of health and safety regulations that make it quite expensive to engage in quite a few businesses, including the food business, whereas in other African countries, you can just make food and sell it, and there's no risk of getting arrested for not complying with food regulations. And then finally, you've got environmental factors, which includes the physical environment and other environmental factors. Obviously, you've got people moving. There's a general trend, maybe not that fast, but there's a trend of people moving towards environmentally friendly products. And there's now more emphasis being placed on recycling and hybrid cars. And there's higher taxes on air travel in efforts to reduce our carbon footprint. And then obviously you can end off with a conclusion where you give a general opinion of the macro environment. This is of course not your final conclusion. We can call it an interim, intermediate, or subsidiary conclusion. And here you just highlight the main facts, the main issues that you picked up in your pestle analysis. Once again, we will iron this out in the next lesson when we look at a practical example. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Let's meet again tomorrow and we'll continue with the market environment, where I just introduced to you guys some of the things you need to consider when you're writing an essay and you're evaluating the market environment. And when we are done with that, we will then go through a couple of practical exercises and examples together, where we take baby steps towards writing a full paper 2 business report. Thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.